Hey guys, I'm coming at you with kind of a longer video here. This is different than my normal TikTok responses because I'm going to go kind of more in depth. That's why I'm doing, horizontal. It's probably going to be a little bit longer. I hope you guys are having a fantastic Christmas season. And as we think about the Christmas season, of course, we're thinking about the birth of Christ. And so is TikTok. So I was scrolling on TikTok today, as I am to do, sadly. And I saw this interaction between two people. One guy goes by the account name Jesus and whatnot. He's a Roman Catholic. The other goes by the account name needgod.net, and he is a evangelical Protestant. And they were debating the sinlessness of Mary, which I covered in a shorts video just a little bit ago, maybe 2 days ago. And they were having this debate about the sinlessness of Mary, and there was a very, very interesting portion of this debate that I saw online. It's a long clip, but in order to understand what we're talking about, you have to watch all of it. Sorry. So go ahead and take a look.
The law of Leviticus that says if a woman gives birth, she cannot touch holy objects or she will be stoned. So where is Mary stoning? Where was she stoned? Show me in the New Testament.
Even if this was the case, this is not proving her sinlessness, Noah. If anything, you're going to say that Mary's breaking the Mosaic law. No, but the best that your argument would prove that Mary's broken the Mosaic law. It's not an argument to show that she's sinless.
No, Ryan, are you saying, like clarify your point? You haven't answered most of my questions. You're saying, just give me a yes or a no. Is Jesus holy? Was Mary, I would say, according to this law, she would be unclean because she gave birth and she's unclean for 7 days. I assume that you'd agree with that. So she cannot touch Jesus.
And so if she's under the Mosaic law, then if your argument is true that means she can't touch Jesus, therefore you think Mary broke the Mosaic law.
No, oh my goodness. What I'm arguing is that she was not unclean because she was sinless. And this verse is about sinful women. So, Mary was not unclean. Hold
up. So she wasn't under the Mosaic law? Is that what you're saying? Because it doesn't say here about sinful women.
Ryan, stop asking me questions. This is my cross-examination.
If a woman conceives and bears a male child, it doesn't say if a sinful woman, it just says if a woman.
Ryan.
Now, is Mary a woman? Yes.
It says that she will be unclean because of the birth.
And did Mary give birth to Jesus?
Are you saying that Jesus' birth was unclean?
Did Mary give birth to Jesus?
Stop asking me questions and answer mine, Ryan.
I'll say yes. Mary gave birth to Jesus. She's a woman. She conceived. She bore a male child, and so she was unclean for 7 days. And what did she do on the 8th day?
So you think that the birth of Jesus was unclean?
She offered a sacrifice.
So you think that the birth of Jesus was unclean?
Well, it made her unclean according to what scriptures. I believe scripture. I don't know if you do, but I believe it because it says a woman.
Ryan, stop trying to accuse me of not believing in scripture and just answer the question.
Do you believe this verse? I believe this verse.
So do you believe that the birth?
She was a woman.
Stop asking me questions. Stop.
I'm not saying. I'm not asking you a question.
Do you believe this verse?
She was a woman.
You said, do you believe this verse?
I believe this verse.
Awesome. Now let me ask a question in my cross-examination, and please answer it. Was the birth of Jesus unclean?
It made her unclean, according to Levitical.
So that's the clip. And obviously, it's a very frustrating exchange to listen to. They're talking past each other. They're talking over each other. Ryan, who's the man on the bottom, I believe, isn't really following the rules of debate. But here's the thing. I think Ryan was right. And I don't just say that because I am a Reformed Protestant who does not believe in the sinlessness of Mary. But I do think Ryan was right because the argument from the man on top, who I believe his name is Noah, from Jesus and Whatnot on TikTok, the argument from Noah doesn't hold up. It doesn't hold up because, in my view, Noah was asking a dishonest question. He asks, was Jesus' birth unclean? But that should not be the question. The question should have been, did the birth of Jesus make Mary unclean? And the answer, according to Scripture, would be yes. Now, the reason that framing the question like this makes it dishonest is we, as Christians, have great reverence for Jesus. Obviously, we worship him as God. We understand that he is God incarnate, the second person of the Trinity taking on flesh. And so saying, was the birth of Jesus unclean, immediately attacks us on an emotional level, where we want to say, no, nothing that Jesus does is unclean. And that's the thing. framing the question like that makes it seem as if Jesus is the one performing an unclean act, which of course is not possible or true. But asking the better question of, did the birth of Jesus make Mary unclean, separates that initial emotional response and allows us to actually evaluate what really happened. And so I think Noah's credibility here falls apart by asking a dishonest question that's really just an attempted emotional trap. The better question is, did the birth of Jesus make Mary unclean? And in light of that question, here's how I think Ryan should have responded. He should have said, the scriptures say that when a woman gives birth to a male child, she will be ceremonially unclean. Mary gave birth to a male child, therefore, she is ceremonially unclean. That is, if you were to just take the passage in Leviticus and the birth narrative in Matthew, or especially in Luke, because it actually gives more detail, you would walk away by saying, okay, Mary gave birth to a male child. Leviticus says that if you give birth to a male child, you're unclean. Therefore, Mary is made unclean. I think both Catholics and Protestants have to agree here that a plain reading of those two texts would lead the reader to understand that Mary was made unclean. Furthermore, going deeper into Luke chapter 2 would lead us to believe that Mary was unclean. We pick up in verse 21, which says, "And when 8 days were fulfilled so that they could circumcise Jesus, his name was called Jesus, and the name was given to him by the angel before he was conceived in the womb." So just calling back to when Mary was visited by Gabriel. Then, verse 22, "And when the days for their cleansing, according to the law of Moses, were fulfilled, they brought him up to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord." These days of cleansing in Luke 2:22 are the days of cleansing that were required by the Mosaic law for childbirth. Now, I do not believe that these days of cleansing are the initial 7, because clearly Jesus has already been alive, he's been incarnate for 8 days because he's been circumcised. But in the Mosaic law, for male children, you have a 7-day period, followed by the circumcision, followed by a longer period of uncleanness. And it would be this longer period of uncleanness, which follows the prior 7 days of uncleanness, that Scripture specifically tells us that Mary and Joseph waited out. So the passage itself explicitly, shall I say, implies, it doesn't say in the exact words, she was unclean, but it says the days of their cleansing. Why would they have to be cleansed if they weren't unclean? So you read the passage in Leviticus and the surrounding context, and you read the passage in Luke and the surrounding context, the immediate context that comes after, and you say, it seems like Mary was made unclean. This just seems to be the most natural reading of what the passage is saying, and it's the way that anyone who opens the Scripture and reads it for themselves is going to come to. Now, Noah, from Jesus and whatnot on top, attempted to say that Mary couldn't have been unclean because she touched Jesus, which she's not allowed to do if she is unclean. But because she touched Jesus, that proves that she isn't unclean, therefore proving that she was kept from uncleanness by virtue of her sinlessness. So this is the argument. And I want you to note, the Catholic argument depends upon an understanding that under normal circumstances, Mary would have been unclean. It depends upon that. But it says that because Jesus was touched by Mary, because Mary touched Jesus, who is holy, therefore, we can infer that Mary was not unclean. Because had she been unclean, she would have been breaking the law by touching Jesus and would have been subject to stoning. And this is the argument. Now, it seems to hold up. But not only does it directly interfere, I'm not going to say contradict, I'm not going to say is refuted, but it interferes with the natural reading of the text where Luke tells us they had to fulfill their uncleanness. It's a rather big leap to say that Jesus would qualify as a holy object within the context of Leviticus. And this is where the second dishonest question comes into play. The second dishonest question is, you don't think Jesus is holy? And he asks this explicitly. He says, do you think Jesus is holy? And Ryan continues on talking about some other thing, which he shouldn't have done. And then Noah says, you don't think Jesus is holy? And he's asking this question, but it's a dishonest question. It's a dishonest question because, yes, obviously Jesus is holy. But the better question is, does Jesus qualify, does Jesus count as a holy object in the context of Leviticus? The question shouldn't be, is Jesus holy? Broadly speaking, the question should have been more specific. Does Jesus count as a holy object as defined in Leviticus? And the answer would be no. I think it's a massive stretch to say that the passage in Leviticus has Jesus in mind when it says holy object. The New Testament doesn't apply that passage to him, to my awareness. If it does, then I concede that this might be a valid argument. I still wouldn't believe it, but I give it more credibility. However, to my knowledge, the New Testament does not apply the passage in Leviticus to Jesus. It says Jesus is holy. Of course he is. He's God. But Jesus is not treated as an object of worship in the temple. Jesus is the temple. Jesus is the fulfillment of the temple. But he's not said to be holy in the same ceremonial holiness that Leviticus is discussing. It's not what the Bible does. And so essentially, this whole conversation boils down to this. Which interpretation requires the least amount of extra-biblical assumptions and insertions and upholds the most amount of present biblical teaching? Option 1. Mary was made unclean by the birth of Jesus, as the passage in Leviticus would tell us is probably true, and as the passage in Luke tells us is true. But holding Jesus didn't violate the Old Testament law because Jesus doesn't fall under the category of holy object within the context of Leviticus. That's option 1. Or, option 2, Mary was not made unclean by the birth of Jesus, despite what Leviticus would lead us to believe and despite what Luke seems to be saying, but she was kept from the uncleanness through her sinlessness, which Scripture nowhere explicitly teaches. And we know that this is true because holding Jesus would have violated the law in Leviticus about holding holy objects, even though that passage is never applied to Jesus. So in option 1, we take what Leviticus says, we take what Luke says, and say, yeah, that seems to be the conclusion. And then we make the necessary conclusion, which is Jesus doesn't count as an Old Testament holy object, so nothing happened here that was faulty. But in option 2, we have to say, well, what Leviticus seems to predict and what Luke seems to be telling us isn't actually what's going on here. But because of this thing that Scripture doesn't explicitly teach us, we know that Mary was sinless and therefore not made unholy. And we can reason to that because we know that Jesus is this holy object, even though Scripture doesn't tell us he's a holy object. And therefore, if Mary had touched him, she would have been stoned, but she wasn't, which means she's not unclean because she's sinless. And you might accuse me of making that sound more ridiculous than it is. You can be the judge of that, but it's certainly more steps in option 2 than in option 1. So, did Ryan respect the regulations of cross-examination? No. I wish he did. I think it would have been better. I wish he answered the questions with a clear, articulated biblical point instead of meandering and asking his own questions and talking over Noah. I think we all wish that was the case. Did it hurt his case that he broke the regulations of cross-examination? Yeah, because it made him look incredible, as in unbelievable. It made him lose credibility because he wasn't following the rules. But does that prove the Catholic position correct? Absolutely not. And when you step back and examine the individual premises of each position, you find that one of them is a lot more complex, a lot more convoluted, and not as clearly derived from the text of Scripture as the other. And although I know my Catholic friends out there, you guys have different standards by how you measure these things, to someone who holds to sola scriptura, and as someone who holds that Scripture is the highest authority, and we do not have the authority to make assumptions or insertions into Scripture that it does not explicitly give us, then we have to say option 1 is better, and option 1 is true. Option 1 is simpler. Option 1 doesn't force us to ignore what Leviticus predicts and what Luke tells us, but option 1 just allows us to say, this is the truth, this is what happened. Yes, are both positions making necessary conclusions? Yeah, in option 1, you're making the necessary conclusion that Jesus doesn't count as an Old Testament object in the context of Leviticus. That's the necessary conclusion that you're making in order to explain what's going on. But in option 2, the necessary conclusion that you're making is a much wider stretch. And you're making that conclusion in order to argue for something that the Bible doesn't explicitly teach, which is the sinlessness of Mary. And in the end, as R.C. Sproul would say, in the final analysis, it all falls apart. And this argument simply doesn't work. Thank you for watching. If you watched all the way to the end, let me know if you like this kind of content. Let me know if you like the topic of the content. I don't like talking about Catholicism all that much. I much prefer to make positive cases for my own theology than tearing down other people's theology. But I saw this and I figured it was worth a short-ish response. So above all, I hope you guys are loving your Christmas season, using the opportunity to focus on the greatness of God and the glory of Jesus Christ. God be with you. God bless.